It feels real, doesn't it? Something solid, something you can hold in your hand. But what if I told you that the most powerful forces shaping our entire world aren't really real at all? What if they're just stories we've all agreed to believe? Welcome to our series from South Africa, Tangible Power of Shared Imagination. Today, we're going to deconstruct the very architecture of our reality. I want you to take a really close look at this. When you see it, your mind immediately thinks value, right? It thinks power. But what is it really? I mean, physically. It's just a piece of paper, well, processed cotton, technically, with some special ink printed on it. By itself, it's worth almost nothing. It's a symbol. It's a shared idea. And that shared idea makes it the most successful piece of fiction ever written. And yet, think about it. This piece of fiction organizes the daily lives of nearly 8 billion people. It's the blueprint for our cities, it's the fuel for our industries, it's the reason armies march, it's this invisible force field that decides who eats, who builds, who thrives, and who is left behind. It's a shared belief that has become as powerful as a law of physics, like gravity. And here's the thing. Most of what you think of as solid, as fixed and unchangeable in your life, is made of this exact same stuff. Just agreement. So in this explainer, we are going to dissect 4 things you think are real, but are actually just incredibly powerful shared fictions. All right, so let's start pulling on that thread. Let's trace the source code of our reality. And we're going to begin with that little piece of paper, the most powerful and convincing fiction ever made. Money. It feels like it's always been here, right? An objective, timeless force of nature. But it's not. The entire global financial system we have today is the end result of a very specific and pretty surprising chain of beliefs. And to really understand the engine that drives our world, you first have to understand a crisis of faith that happened in the 16th century. So what's so fascinating here is watching how one idea, one belief, creates a chain reaction that builds a reality nobody could have designed. It all kicks off in 1536. A theologian named John Calvin introduces this idea called double predestination. The concept is pretty stark. Before the beginning of time, God has already decided who is going to be saved and who is going to be damned, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to change that verdict. Now, you can imagine this created this deep, gnawing anxiety among believers. I mean, how could you ever know if you were one of the chosen? Well, the answer they came up with was worldly success. You can earn your way into heaven, but your material prosperity, your wealth, could be seen as a sign of God's favor. This sparked a whole new work ethic. But you weren't supposed to spend that wealth on lavish things. That was seen as sinful. Instead, your duty was to accumulate it, to reinvest it, and to make it grow, all as proof that you were one of the elect. This ethic led to these massive pools of capital, especially in the Dutch Republic, which was a Calvinist society. For the first time, huge amounts of private wealth started piling up in the world's first modern banks. Fast forward to 1694. That Dutch capital merges with English military power, and they create a brand new kind of beast, the Bank of England. It was a private company, but it had a state charter, and it did something revolutionary. It loaned its massive private wealth to the state, and the state promised to pay it back with interest. The paper receipts for that government debt began to circulate as if they were gold themselves. This was the birth of modern currency. It wasn't backed by a physical thing, but by faith in the government's promise to pay. But you see, this new system created a relentless, hungry machine. The government's debt had to be paid back with interest, and that requires constant, never-ending economic growth. A static economy means the government defaults. So how do you get that growth? Well, you need new markets, new labor, and new resources. That insatiable hunger for growth became the primary engine of the British Empire. The conquest of lands across Africa and Asia was, in a very real sense, a debt-servicing project. So, the global economy we live in today, with its stock markets, derivatives, and national debts, is still running on the genetic code written back in 1536. It all started with a belief about God. Okay, so that same basic principle, a belief creating reality, it applies to things that feel even more fundamental than money. Let's look at a fiction that literally governs every single second of your day. And the funny part is, it was invented by a committee in a room less than 150 years ago. The time on your phone, on your watch, it feels real. It feels natural, connected to the rising and setting of the sun. It's not. It's a political agreement. The time is whatever we all agree it is.
Believe it or not, before the late 1800s, there was no such thing as global time. Time was a purely local thing. Each town set its own clocks based on the sun. Noon was just when the sun was highest in the sky where you were standing. That meant noon in one city could be several minutes different from noon in a city just 100 kilometers away. And for centuries, that worked just fine. But then came two new technologies that made this chaos a real problem: the railway and the telegraph. Trying to schedule a train across dozens of different local times was a logistical nightmare. So, in 1884, a group of men from 25 countries got together in a room in Washington, D.C. for something called the International Meridian Conference. Their mission? To impose a single, rational order on time itself. And in that room, they just agreed. They agreed to carve up the entire planet into 24 time zones, all measured from a line they decided would run through Greenwich, England. They drew imaginary lines on a map and, just like that, invented global time. And this decision has very real political consequences. China technically spans 5 natural time zones, but the entire country runs on a single one, Beijing time. This means that in the far west of China, the sun is at its highest point around 3 p.m. That's not a natural fact. It's a political choice to enforce unity. For similar reasons, India decided to set its time zone 5.5 hours ahead of Greenwich, just to be distinct. The point is, the sun has no idea what time it is in Beijing or Delhi. A committee decided. And this is a perfect example of how the most successful fictions are the ones that become so normal, it feels absolutely absurd to even question them.
Our third case, which we're looking at through the specific African lens of this series, gets into one of the most destructive and consequential constructions in all of modern history. And that is the belief that humankind is naturally divided into distinct biological races. So how does an idea like this become so powerful, so real, that it feels like a physical thing? We can actually map it out using a 3-stage model from the sociologists Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. It's basically the manufacturing process for turning a fiction into a fact. First comes externalization. This is where a subjective belief, in this case the idea of a natural human hierarchy, gets projected out into the world. It escapes from people's heads and gets written down into legal codes, like the apartheid laws in South Africa or the slave codes in America. It gets dressed up as objective fact and pseudoscientific theories. It becomes the operating system for colonial governments all across Africa and Asia. The idea is literally built into the foundations of society. Next comes objectification. At this stage, the belief starts to feel like a permanent part of nature, like a river or a mountain. Society completely forgets that people invented it. Its human origins get erased. Think of a path through a forest. The first person to walk it makes a choice. But as more and more people use that same path, it gets worn into the ground. Eventually, it just looks like it was always there. It's the same with this idea. Courts, schools, governments, they all start treating racial categories as if they are natural, objective facts. The fiction now seems as solid and unchangeable as the ground we walk on. And finally, the most powerful stage, internalization. This is when generations of people are born into that world. For them, the racial hierarchy isn't an idea you can choose to believe or not. It's just common sense. It's reality. It shapes how they see themselves, how they see others, what they think is possible for their lives. It feels deeply, personally, and intuitively true because their entire world has been engineered to confirm it, every single day. Let's be perfectly clear. The science is now settled. The Human Genome Project confirmed it. There is no biological basis for what we call race. It's a social fiction, not a biological fact. But the consequences of that fiction, they were and still are brutally, measurably real. You can measure them in the centuries of the transatlantic slave trade. You can measure them in the segregation laws of the United States and the Population Registration Act of South Africa. And you can still measure them today in the massive racial wealth gaps that define so many of our societies. The fiction built a very real world of pain and inequality, a world that continues long after the belief itself has been scientifically debunked. Okay, for our final proof case, let's look at the lines on a map. These lines have absolutely no physical reality, and yet millions of people have been willing to kill and to die for them. These lines on the map weren't discovered, they were drawn. They were invented. Think about the Berlin Conference in 1884. A group of European powers got together in a room in Germany and literally partitioned the entire continent of Africa. They took out rulers and pencils and just drew lines on a map, lines that sliced right through ancient cultures, kingdoms, language groups, and trade routes. A few decades later, in 1916, 2 diplomats, one British, one French, secretly drew another line, this time in the sand, creating the borders of the modern Middle East. Now, these borders don't actually exist in nature. You can't see them from an airplane. A bird flying over the land has no idea it just crossed from one country to another. They are nothing more than a shared agreement, a fiction that we enforce with passports and armed guards. But that imaginary line has total life and death consequences. Which side of that line you happen to be born on determines everything: your citizenship, your rights, your life expectancy. It determines whether you're a citizen with rights or a refugee with none. An idea, drawn in a room thousands of miles away, became the most important reality for millions of people. So, we've seen these four big examples: money, time, race, borders. The big question is, how does this actually work? What is the underlying mechanism that allows a shared belief to become a concrete reality? Well, it turns out there are two core ideas, one from philosophy and one from sociology, that give us the blueprint.
It really all starts with how we perceive the world. Back in 1781, a philosopher named Immanuel Kant gave us a really powerful tool for thinking about this. He said we have to distinguish between two kinds of reality. First, there's the noumenal world. You can think of this as reality as it actually is, the thing in itself, completely independent of any human mind. It's the raw data of the universe. But here's Kant's big insight. We can never, ever experience that world directly. Why not? Because everything we experience is part of the second world, the phenomenal world. This is the world as it appears to us. Kant argued that our minds aren't just passive cameras recording what's out there. No, our minds are active builders. They take that raw data from the noumenal world and automatically filter and structure it through built-in mental software, our concepts of time, space, cause, and effect. Here's an analogy. Imagine you were born wearing a pair of blue-tinted glasses that you could never, ever take off. You would experience your entire life in shades of blue. You could never know for sure what colors the world really is without the blue tint. For Kant, our minds are those glasses. The phenomenal world, the world we see through our mental filters, is the only world we can ever know. And when you get an entire society of people wearing the same glasses, they build a shared phenomenal reality together. Things like money and borders and time zones don't exist out there in the raw, noumenal world. They are phenomenal constructions built by our collective minds.
So if Kant explains the why, this next idea explains the how. Over a century after Kant, the sociologist W.I. Thomas gave us the social engine that makes this all work. It's called the Thomas Theorem, and it's a beautifully simple but powerful idea. It just says that what people believe to be real is more important than what is objectively real because people act based on their beliefs, and those actions create very real consequences in the world.
The classic way to understand this is with a bank run. Let's say you have a perfectly healthy bank. It's solvent, its books are balanced. But then a false rumor starts to spread. The bank is about to collapse. People hear this and they define that situation as real. The objective truth, that the bank is actually fine, suddenly doesn't matter. What matters is what they believe. So acting on that belief, everyone rushes to the bank to withdraw their money all at once. That collective behavior is the run on the bank. And that action is what actually causes the healthy bank to fail. It can't pay everyone at the same time. The belief created the exact reality it predicted. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's the Thomas Theorem in action.
So now let's plug our four cases directly into this theorem. If a society defines a piece of paper as having value, people act on that definition, and the consequence is the entire global economy. If a group of powerful men define a line on a map as a national border, states act on it, and the consequence is real refugee crises. If a society defines race as a biological category, institutions act on that definition, and the consequence is real slavery and measurable wealth gaps. If a committee defines what the time is, we all act on it, and the consequence is every synchronized flight schedule on the planet. Kant explains why our minds build reality. The Thomas Theorem explains how that constructed reality gets its real-world tangible power.
And all of this, all of it, leads us to what is maybe the most important question of all. And this isn't a question about philosophy anymore. It's a question about power. I mean, think about it. If our world is built on agreements, if reality is something we collectively believe into existence, then the most absolute form of power isn't having the biggest army or the most money. The ultimate power is the power to define what is real for everyone else. This ultimate power actually has a name. It's called epistemic authority. It's the socially granted right to define truth. For thousands of years, that authority was held by priests and monarchs, who defined reality through divine right. Then, after the Enlightenment, that power shifted to scientists and universities, who defined reality through reason and evidence. But who holds it today? Is it the media companies that frame the stories we see every day? Is it the central banks who literally define the value of our money? Or is that authority now quietly shifting to the algorithms in our phones, the ones that curate our feeds and individually shape what each of us sees as the truth? Whoever holds epistemic authority, they are the architects of our world. They don't just play the game. They get to write the rules of reality itself. And understanding this mechanism, this architecture of agreed reality,
That's really the core mission of our whole series, Tangible Power of Shared Imagination, which we're making for you here in South Africa. You know, most of us go through life experiencing the world as a set of fixed, unchangeable facts, things that are as solid as mountains. This series exists for one simple reason: to help you distinguish what is truly fixed, like gravity, from what has merely been agreed upon. Because understanding the machinery of collective belief is the only real defense against being unknowingly controlled by it.
It leaves us with a final question to consider.